I work with a team in health and life sciences that ran a retrospective every single sprint for months, not sporadically, not when things went wrong, every single sprint at the end. And the meeting had a named owner. Leadership sponsored it, so attendance was just perfect. Nobody skipped. Nobody dialed in from a parking lot with their camera off. On paper, this team was doing the thing. And it produced nothing, nothing. Months of retrospectives, and I could not point you to one single thing about how that team worked that was different at the end of it. I'm telling you this first because you've probably heard the opposite version of this podcast episode. The version where retros are the practice everybody skips and the fix is just to stop skipping them, right? And there's real data behind that. In this year's State of Agile Marketing report, 52% of marketers who rate their Agile implementation as extremely successful run retrospectives versus 35% of everybody else. And that's the widest gap of any practice we measured. Wider than sprints, wider than Kanban boards, wider than WIP limits. So the practice works. It just didn't work there. That gap between a team doing retros correctly and a team getting something out of them is what this episode is all about, because that team eventually fixed it. It took one change. It wasn't a training and it wasn't more effort. It was actually less. Welcome to the Agile Marketing Edge, the first podcast dedicated to turning Agile theory into real-world marketing breakthroughs. I'm Monica Georgiev, principal at AgileSherpas, and your guide on this climb to smarter, faster, outcome-driven marketing. Every week, we dig into the what, who, and how behind Agile marketing, from building high-velocity workflows and cutting waste to measuring what actually matters and scaling success across teams. Quick note, in case you were bracing for a different voice, I am not Andrea Fryrear. I'm Monica Georgiev, and I'm taking this one. She'll be back. She's not lost somewhere on the mountain. She'll be back for sure. But I'll say this, though, of all the episodes to hand off, this is the right one for me. That team I just told you about, I'm the person who was actually in the room with them. Retros are where I spend an enormous amount of my actual working life, which means I've watched a lot of them do nothing, and I've watched what changes when one finally clicks. So the stories in this episode are mine, and so are the scars. Today, we're squarely in the how, the day-to-day practices, the stuff that actually happens on a Tuesday afternoon. We're going after the practice that gets skipped more than any other, defended more weakly than any other, and correlates more strongly with success than any other. Those three things are related, and by the end of this, I want you to understand exactly how, and I'll come back and tell you what fixed that team. I promise. Let me be honest about the data first, because I don't want to oversell it. 52 versus 35% is a correlation. I can't tell you that adding a retro to your calendar next Tuesday is going to make your team extremely successful, though. That's not how any of this works. And if I said it, I'd be overselling this practice the way people oversell every other one. But I can tell you the mechanism I think is underneath it, and it's not complicated. Truly isn't. Look at your Agile practices as a set. Stand up coordinates the work. Planning selects the work. A review inspects the output. A Kanban board is going to visualize the flow. Every single one of those operates inside the system. They're how the machine runs. The retro is the only one that actually operates on the system. It's the only practice whose entire job is to change the other practices. Crazy, right? Which means if you drop it, here's what actually happens. You don't stop being Agile. You freeze. Whatever version of the process you installed in month one, the sprint length, someone picked, the board column someone drew, the definition of done, nobody has looked at since, that's your process now, permanently. and you will run it in month 36 exactly the way you ran it in month 1. And you will call that agile because the ceremonies are still on the calendar. That's the theater, not the fake stand-up, not the sprint that's really a waterfall in 2 weeks costume. The theater is a system with no capacity to change itself, performing the visual language of adaptability. And it explains the gap in the data better than retros are magic. The teams running retros aren't succeeding because of the retro meeting itself. They're succeeding because they're the teams whose process has been through like 30 rounds of correction, and yours has been through 0. They're not smarter than you. They just have a loop and you don't. And here's the part that should make you uncomfortable, because it's what happened to my health and life sciences team. A retro that changes nothing is functionally identical to no retro at all. Same frozen process, same theater. The only difference is that theirs cost 30 minutes a sprint and gave everyone the reassuring feeling of having done the work, right? So the question for this episode isn't, should you run retros? Obviously, you should. The question is, why so many of them? The skipped ones and the dutifully performed ones produce nothing. And the answer is that the loop breaks in 2 very specific places that I'll talk about. A feedback loop needs actual feedback going in. Most retros don't have any. You've been in this room, right? Somebody asks what went well. Everybody says the team worked really hard. Somebody asks what didn't. Someone says communication could be better. Everyone nods because communication could always be better. And it's the one answer that indicts everybody. 30 minutes later, you leave having named 0 real problems. That's not a facilitation failure. That's a safety failure. And it's worth understanding precisely. Amy Edmondson's research on psychological safety started with a finding that looked at first like it was a mistake. She was studying hospital nursing units, and the units with the best leadership and the best team climate were reporting more medication errors, not fewer, which is backwards, right? Better teams should make fewer mistakes, no? They did make fewer mistakes. They just reported vastly more of them, because on those teams, you could say, I got that wrong out loud without it becoming a permanent fact about you. On the other units, the errors were still happening. They were just invisible, right? Couldn't see them. Now put that in your retro. When your team says communication could be better, the errors haven't stopped. You just can't see them. And you cannot fix what your team has decided is not safe to name. Here's what I'll push back on, how this actually gets handled. I think this is important. Psychological safety gets treated a lot of Agile content as an outcome. Do retros, build trust, get safety. And I think that's actually backwards, or at best, it's circular. Safety is the input. Without it, the retro produces nothing. And then people correctly conclude that the retro is a waste of time, and then it comes off the calendar. The lack of safety is what killed the practice, and the missing practice gets the blame. The most common version of this on marketing teams is stunningly mundane. The most senior person in the room speaks first. They say what they thought went wrong, and that's it. That's now the agenda. Nobody contradicts the VP in a meeting about mistakes, right? You just run a 30-minute meeting to confirm what one person already believed. There are 2 mechanical fixes, and neither requires a culture initiative. First, the person with the most positional power should speak last, not first, every time. Second, ask about the system, not the people, not who dropped the ball on the launch, but at what point in this launch did we first know we were going to be late, and what stopped that from reaching anyone? Same information, completely different room. Say you fix the input. People start telling the truth. Now you've got the second failure, and this one is dressed up as productivity. So keep an eye out. You end the retro with a board full of stickies, 11 improvement ideas. It really feels fantastic to see the volume. Look how much we surfaced. Then everyone walks back into a sprint that was already full before the retro started, and precisely none of those 11 things end up happening. Next retro, someone mentions one of them again. Slightly more tired voice this time. Third retro, nobody mentions it because the team has learned the actual lesson here. This meeting is where suggestions go to be acknowledged. That's the death spiral, and notice that it feeds right back into problem number 2. Once the output side stops producing change, the input side is going to dry up. Why would you risk saying the uncomfortable thing in a meeting that demonstrably changes nothing? So you say communication could be better, right? And we're right back where we started. Site reliability engineers solved a version of this with the blameless postmortem. And there's one rule worth stealing outright from there. When something breaks, the postmortem examines what in the system allowed it: the alerting, the deploy process, the documentation, not who typed the command. And then the fixes get filed as real work with an owner and a due date in the same tracker as everything else the team committed to. But I want to be precise about the difference between that and a retro because they get conflated constantly. A postmortem is triggered by a failure. Something broke, and you go find out why. A retro isn't triggered by anything. It runs on a cadence whether or not the sprint was a disaster, which means it catches the slow stuff as well. The workaround everybody's quietly using, the handoff that costs 2 days every single time, the approval step nobody can justify but nobody will remove. Postmortems find the fire. Retros find the wiring. And marketing teams are usually fine at the first one, actually. At first, informally. We'll all sit down and debrief a launch that blew up, right? We'll never once ask why every launch takes 3 weeks longer than we planned for. That's the whole trick, right? An improvement that doesn't go on the board is just a wish. And Norm Kurth, who wrote the book on retrospectives back in 2001, put the framing around all of this before software teams got there. His prime directive, paraphrased, is that we enter the retrospective believing everyone did the best job they could with what they knew at the time, the skills and resources they had, and the situation they were in. It's not a nicety. It's a constraint that makes the conversation productive because it takes who's at fault off the table and leaves only what would we need to have known as a topic. Here's the version I'd actually argue for on a marketing team specifically, and it's more aggressive than most Agile people will tell you. Leave with one action item, not 11, just one. One is enough, with a name on it and a date on it, sitting on your board as real work that pushes something else out. One improvement that ships beats 11 that get acknowledged, just acknowledged. And there's a compounding argument here that people miss. One real change every 2 weeks is 26 changes a year to how your team is working. Nobody's process survives 26 deliberate corrections and stays mediocre. There's no way. Let me go back to that health and life sciences team for a moment, because I promised you that I would tell you what fixed them. First, what was actually going wrong, and it's both of the failures that I just described, right? Running at the same time with this team. The same stilted format every single sprint. The thornier topics got acknowledged and glided past. They'd end up with a list of action items and no owner attached to any of them. And then came the next retro. Nobody asked about the last batch of actions. Did anyone do those? Did they help? Nobody knew because nobody looked. So here's the fix. It wasn't a book. It wasn't a training, which I'll admit is an awkward thing for me to say out loud. But the facilitator got to watch somebody else run one. That's it. That changed things. The reaction was just immediate. Oh, that's what this is supposed to feel like. That's what it's for. Sit with that for a moment, because I think it's the most useful thing in this here episode. That was not a knowledge problem at all. She knew what a retrospective was. She'd been running them every sprint for months and months, correctly, by the book, in fact. It was a reference problem. She had never been in a good one. So she was faithfully reproducing the only version she had ever seen. That's most of marketing, don't you think? We have very few people who've experienced a genuinely useful retrospective and can pattern match it towards something like that. So we default to the saved version, collect the post-its, thank everyone, and just adjourn. What that team does now is narrower, not bigger. They're not trying to harvest every observation in the room anymore. They pick the highest priority thing and stay on it until there's a real decision with a real name on it, fewer post-its, more change. That's also the answer to the homework objection, by the way. If your retro requires a themed board, an icebreaker where everyone picks a weather emoji for how the sprint felt, and 40 minutes of prep, you built a workshop, my friend. Workshops are expensive, and expensive things get canceled first, which is exactly what's been happening to you. 30 minutes, one honest question, and on time. And rotate the facilitator, not for fairness, so more people on your team get the reference experience, like this one team did. You're not installing a practice this week. You're closing one loop, 4 steps, and the order matters. 1, at the end of your next sprint, run one retro with no agenda beyond a single specific question. Not, how did the sprint go? A question about something you have personally noticed in your team. Why did those webinar assets go out the door twice? What made last week feel so much worse than the week before? Bring that question, source ideas on it, and hold the room to it. One real question beats a full agenda. Try it out. Number 2, leave with 1 or 2 action items with clear owners. Ask for volunteers first. If nobody bites, ask the room who'd be the right person to own it. That question is much easier for a team to answer than who wants more work. Am I right? An action item with no name on it, though, is just like a wish. So don't fall into that trap. 3, put it on your work management board as real work. Jira, Asana, Miro, same board as everything else. If your team sizes work, size it. Give it a Fibonacci number like anything else entering the sprint. That does something subtle and important. It makes the improvement compete really honestly with your other delivery work instead of living in a parallel universe where it's free. 4, write yourself a note to open the next retro that you're facilitating with the action item. Did it move? Did it help? Did it stay stagnant? Everyone skips this step, and it's the one that actually closes the feedback loop. It's also the fastest way to prove to a really skeptical team that this meeting has consequences. That's it. That's the practice separating the extremely successful teams from everyone else by 17 percentage points. 30 minutes, one honest question, one change that actually ships. You already have the time. You've just been spending it on a meeting that doesn't change anything, or on no meeting at all. Until next time, I'm Monica Georgiev, and I'm keeping Andrea's line because it's a good one. The struggle is real, but so is Agile marketing.